I remember the moment the first notes came out from us. Every possible way to doubt yourself and every possible way to encourage yourself. So many moments. I remember I just, trust. Just trust myself, trust Mira, trust our capacity, technique, history, everything. I put the first notes together.
The way I listen to that tuning is like smell. I sniff out the
truffle.
The truffle, yeah.
For me, it's temperature and then color. So probably we're using similar sense of us rather than thinking about how to play the violin.
Yeah.
It's more sense to find a truffle.
In this audiovisual talk, I respond to Ben Spatz's invitation for performers to return to the language of technique in order to get at the aboutness of embodied work. To do this, I'll draw on Gaston Bachelard's framework of phenomenotechnique via Spatz's writings on embodied theater practice. I'm interested in Spatz's premise that performance, inclusive of its phenomena, practice, identity, is made of technique, and that technique, as knowledge, is the vehicle of embodied research. The focus of my phenomenotechnical reflections will be this performance of my friend James Weeks' string duo, Winter Arc, filmed live at LSO St. Luke's in London, January 2024. Performing with me is violist Chihiro Ono, whose voice you just heard and who's collaborated with me in making these reflections. Phenomenotechnique, in Bachelard's framework, aimed to acknowledge the epistemic function of technical objects in the everyday activity of laboratory researchers. In this framework, epistemic phenomena are not merely found, but materially instructed, and thus technical objects acquire epistemic functions in what Bachelard calls a material discursive circuit. Bachelard highlights the relationality that this modus operandi elicits between method and experience. One must know the method of knowing in order to grasp the object to be known. Spatz's interpretive adaptation of the phenomenotechnical framework draws an analogy between Bachelard's technical objects and embodied technique, which Spatz has elsewhere theorized as transmissible and repeatable knowledge of relatively reliable possibilities afforded by human embodiment. For Spatz, a phenomenotechnical account affords a thick technical description of the epistemic objects of embodied research work. Here, the language of technique points not only to phenomena arising in embodied practice, but specifically the epistemic objects which unfold at a research edge. For Chihiro and I, these might take the form of new ways of sifting, stacking, and/or prioritizing within precise but indeterminate pitch spaces, as you'll hear presently. Hans-Jörg Reinberger suggests that such epistemic objects can rupture out of an experimental system which plays out its own intrinsic capacities, the more the experimenter learns to handle the system until it is able to surprise the experimenter with its own characteristics. So I am asking, what would a phenomenotechnical description of experimental music performance consist of? My technique as a violinist, shown here, is multimodal in its embodiment, and so must be in its articulation, from instance to instance of practice, like this performance, and in the language with which I attempt to expose it. Kim Vinks describes how pathways to knowledge can join artwork of seemingly dissimilar genre, aesthetic, and content. Reinberger concurs, suggesting that specialization creates epistemic flexibility, which Bachelard calls differential reproduction. A relationship between embodied practice and video documentation can be the site of phenomenotechnical reflection, which for Spatz, whose post-Grotowski physical theater practice involves whole-body postural work, takes place in a largely gestural modality, what I'll call a manual-somatic pattern of technique. I would suggest that a phenomenotechnical reflection on musical practice must reflect three distinct patterns of embodied technique. I'll call these manual-somatic, aural attentive, and reflective-conceptual. In an instance of practice, these patterns of technique are continuant and entangled, but to explore how these constitute technical knowledge, I'll artificially pull them apart, using three annotations of the same section of video. At the thick intersection of these pathways is a phenomenotechnical articulation, using the language of technique to trace the production of phenomena that is embodied and experienced. This mode of reflection elucidates the how. What Spatz proposes could lead to consensual claims on reality among practitioners with sufficiently similar technical knowledge. In this sense, the phenomenotechnical mode shares qualities with pedagogical language. The difference lies in the relationship of the practitioner to the knowledge objects under reflection. In pedagogy, language, as well as demonstration, documentation, etc., articulates the known in order to accompany a learner across an epistemic threshold. Phenomenotechnical reflection, in contrast, points to the research edge. Reinberger describes how a practitioner articulates the epistemic, what is becoming known to them, as phenomenon provoked as a problem at the knowledge horizon, Bachelard's material discursive circuit. So, who is the research audience for a phenomenotechnical description? For Spatz, phenomenotechnics speak to embodied researchers, to a disciplinary we, those grounded in shared technique, where the combination of technical and phenomenological perspectives would allow another person with sufficiently similar skills to travel along an analogous epistemic pathway, encountering some of the same territories and objects. For those very close in technical knowledge, very little articulation might be necessary beyond demonstration. For example, for Chihiro and myself, much of the sharing of the techniques shown here took place in playing and in listening. For this audience, the phenomenotechnical mode can articulate patterns of technique that can be differentially realized by multiple performers or performances. I want to suggest, however, that phenomenotechnical description has utility for a second research audience, one who is perhaps less technically near, but is nonetheless invested in the insights of embodied work. For this audience, phenomenotechnique can act as a thick description, elucidating a multivalent depth of field that plays out in practice.